My wife's brother kept bringing his dogs to our house despite my allergies. The first time Kyle brought his German Shepherds to our house, I was clearing plates from dinner when I felt my throat start to close. My eyes watered and swelled within minutes, my chest tightening like someone was sitting on it. I excused myself to take Benadryl in the bathroom, while my wife Rachel laughed with her brother in the living room, the dogs panting somewhere near my chair. When I came back out 20 minutes later with my face puffy and red, Kyle looked at me with this expression I couldn't quite read. Not concern exactly, but something more calculating. He said his dogs were emotional support animals for his anxiety, and he couldn't leave them home alone. Rachel touched my arm and asked if I could just deal with it this once because Kyle really needed the family support right now. I said yes, because it was one dinner, and I loved my wife and wanted her brother to feel welcome in our home. That was 8 months ago, and I've been wheezing through antihistamines ever since. Kyle started showing up 2 or 3 times a week, always with the dogs, always with some reason why he needed to visit right then. His apartment was being fumigated. His neighbor was having construction done. He needed to borrow tools or drop off mail, or just wanted to see his sister. The dogs would follow me from room to room, staying close enough that I'd feel my allergies kick in, but never actually touching me. Rachel said they were just being friendly, and I was overreacting. Kyle said they were perfectly trained service animals and wouldn't bother anyone, but I'd spend every visit with swollen eyes and a closing throat, taking double doses of allergy medication just to breathe in my own home. My allergist, Dr. Patel, finally told me at my monthly appointment that I was developing chronic asthma from constant allergen exposure. She said if I didn't eliminate the source completely, I'd end up with permanent respiratory damage. She wrote me a prescription for an inhaler and looked at me seriously. "This isn't sustainable," she said. "Your body is under constant attack." I came home from that appointment ready to set boundaries with Kyle. I found Rachel in the kitchen and explained what Dr. Patel had said about permanent damage and eliminating allergen sources. I told her we needed to ask Kyle to stop bringing the dogs over, that we could meet him at restaurants or parks instead. Rachel's face went cold, and she said Kyle's mental health needs were more important than my mild discomfort. I showed her the inhaler prescription and the medical notes about developing asthma. She said I was being dramatic and trying to exclude her brother from family events. She said Kyle had been through a lot lately with his divorce and job stress and needed support from the people who loved him. I asked if my health mattered at all, and she said of course it did, but I could just take medication like millions of other people with allergies. She walked out of the kitchen before I could respond, and I stood there holding my new inhaler, realizing my wife was choosing her brother's convenience over my ability to breathe. 2 days later, Kyle showed up unannounced at 3 p.m. on a Thursday. I was working from home in my office when I heard the garage door open and the sound of dog nails clicking across the hardwood floors. I came out to find Kyle letting his German Shepherds into my house with a key I didn't know he had. Rachel wasn't home. She was at work until 6 p.m. I asked Kyle what he was doing here, and he said Rachel had given him a garage code and key for emergencies. I asked what the emergency was, and he said he'd had a panic attack and needed a safe place to calm down. The dogs immediately headed toward my office where I'd been working, sniffing around my desk and my chair. Kyle said they were trained to provide deep pressure therapy during his anxiety episodes, and they needed to check the house for threats. I felt my throat starting to itch and my eyes beginning to water. I told Kyle I was sorry he was having a panic attack, but he couldn't be here with the dogs when Rachel wasn't home. He looked at me with that same calculating expression from the first dinner and said Rachel had specifically told him he could come over anytime he needed to. I called Rachel at work, and she answered annoyed, asking what was wrong. I explained Kyle was at the house with the dogs, even though she wasn't home, and I needed her to tell him to leave. She said she'd given Kyle permission to use our house as a safe space during mental health crises, and I was being unsupportive and cruel. I said I was literally developing asthma from his dogs and couldn't breathe in my own home. She said we'd talk about it when she got home and hung up. Kyle was standing in the hallway listening to my side of the conversation. He smiled and said it sounded like Rachel had his back, then walked into my bedroom with both dogs following him. I stood in the doorway watching them move around my personal space, sniffing my clothes in the closet and circling my side of the bed. Kyle said they were checking for threats as part of their training. I asked him to leave, and he said he'd leave when he felt calm enough to drive safely. That took another 90 minutes, during which I sat in my car in the garage taking antihistamines and using my new inhaler while Kyle and his dogs occupied my house. This pattern continued for the next 3 months. Kyle would show up unannounced, always when Rachel wasn't home, always with some mental health emergency that required him to be in my house with his dogs. I'd come home from running errands to find him in my bedroom or my office, the dogs positioned around my belongings. He'd be on his phone or watching TV in my living room, perfectly calm despite the supposed panic attack that brought him there. I started documenting every incident with timestamps and photos. I took pictures of the dogs in my bedroom, screenshots of my Ring doorbell showing Kyle arriving when Rachel was at work, copies of my increased allergy medication prescriptions. I showed Rachel the documentation one evening and she accused me of stalking her brother and trying to build a case against him like he was a criminal. She said I was being paranoid and controlling and she was tired of my complaints about Kyle's mental health needs. I asked why her brother's mental health mattered more than my physical health, and she said I was trying to make her choose between her husband and her family. My boss noticed my declining work performance and pulled me aside after a meeting where I'd had to step out twice to use my inhaler. I explained the situation and he suggested I work from the office full-time instead of from home if my house was triggering my allergies. I started spending 10-hour days at the office just to avoid being home when Kyle might show up. Rachel got angry that I was never home and accused me of avoiding her. I said I was avoiding her brother's dogs because they were literally making me sick. She said I was being melodramatic, and plenty of people managed their allergies without making it everyone else's problem. I showed her my medical bills from the past 4 months, over $2,000 in allergist visits, medications, and emergency inhaler refills. She glanced at them and said healthcare was expensive for everyone, and I shouldn't use money to manipulate her into excluding Kyle. I realized then that nothing I said or showed her would matter because she'd already decided Kyle's needs came first. The breaking point came on a Wednesday afternoon when I left work early with a migraine. I came home at 2 p.m. and found Kyle's truck in my driveway. I sat in my car for a minute deciding whether to just drive away, but this was my house, and I was tired of being pushed out of my own space. I went inside through the front door and heard the dogs before I saw them. They were in my bedroom again, and Kyle was going through my dresser drawers. I stood in the doorway and asked what the hell he was doing. He turned around slowly and said he was looking for Rachel's birthday present because he knew I'd hidden it somewhere and he wanted to coordinate gifts. I said her birthday wasn't for 3 months and he needed to leave immediately. He smiled and said he'd leave when he was ready, then went back to searching through my things. The dogs positioned themselves between me and Kyle, not aggressive exactly, but alert and watching me. I pulled out my phone to call Rachel and Kyle said, "Go ahead, she already knows I'm here." I called anyway, and Rachel answered with that same annoyed tone. I told her Kyle was in our bedroom going through my dresser, and she needed to come home right now. She sighed and said Kyle had texted her that he was having an episode and needed to be somewhere safe. I said he was literally searching through my private belongings, and this wasn't about mental health anymore. She said I was catastrophizing, and Kyle probably just needed something and didn't want to bother me by asking. I asked if she was serious, and she said she'd deal with it when she got home at 6 p.m. like usual. I hung up and told Kyle he had 5 minutes to get out or I was calling the police. He looked at me with that calculating expression again and said, "Rachel would be really upset if I involved the police in a family matter." He left with his dogs, but not before the dogs circled my room one more time, sniffing my clothes and my bedding with what looked like deliberate focus. I sat on my bed after they left and realized my marriage might be ending because my wife cared more about enabling her brother than protecting her husband. That night, Rachel came home, and we had the worst fight of our marriage. She said I'd threatened her brother with police and made him feel unsafe in his sister's home. I said he'd been going through my personal belongings without permission, and I had every right to want him out. She said Kyle had explained he was looking for a charging cable, and I'd overreacted like I always did about everything involving him. I pulled up the Ring camera footage from my bedroom that I'd recently installed and showed her Kyle going through my dresser, my nightstand, even the pockets of my pants in the closet. She watched the footage and said there was probably a reasonable explanation, and I was trying to make Kyle look bad. I stared at her in disbelief and said a reasonable explanation for searching someone's bedroom when they're not home is breaking and entering. She said Kyle wasn't a stranger, he was family, and I needed to stop treating him like a criminal. I asked when she'd given him a key and garage code, and she said months ago because he needed somewhere safe to go during anxiety episodes. I asked why she hadn't discussed that with me first, since it was my house too, and she said she didn't need my permission to help her own brother. I moved into the guest room that night and started looking at apartments online. Rachel noticed and asked if I was seriously considering leaving over her brother visiting too much. I said I was considering leaving because she'd given her brother unrestricted access to our home without consulting me, dismissed my serious medical condition as an inconvenience, and refused to believe evidence when it was shown directly to her. She said I was being overdramatic, and if I left, it would prove I never really loved her. I said if she kept choosing Kyle over me, she'd find out exactly how serious I was. We barely spoke for the next week. I worked from the office and came home late, avoiding Kyle's usual visiting hours. Rachel sent me texts asking when I'd apologize to Kyle for threatening him and making him feel unwelcome. I sent back my medical bills and my allergist's notes about permanent respiratory damage. She didn't respond. On Monday morning, I came home from the gym at 9 a.m. and found Kyle's truck in my driveway again. Rachel had left for work an hour earlier. I sat in my car and called a non-emergency police line to report an unwanted person in my home with a key I hadn't authorized. The operator said, since it was a domestic situation with family, I should try to resolve it directly first. I said I'd tried that for 8 months, and it wasn't working. She said, unless there was immediate danger, they couldn't force someone to leave a property if another resident had given them permission to be there. I hung up and called animal control instead, reporting that there were 2 large dogs in my home without my permission, and I was allergic and needed them removed for medical reasons. The operator said they'd send an officer to document the situation. Officer Janet Mendez arrived 30 minutes later, and I met her in the driveway. I explained the situation as clearly as I could without sounding crazy. a brother-in-law with supposed emotional support dogs who kept coming to my house despite my severe allergies, my wife who'd given him a key without telling me, the months of declining health and medical bills. Officer Mendez listened carefully and asked to see my medical documentation. I pulled up my phone and showed her the allergist notes, the prescriptions, the medical bills, the timeline of increasing respiratory problems. She said she'd go inside and assess the situation. I gave her my key and waited outside while she went into my house. 15 minutes later, she came back out and asked me to come with her. Her expression was serious and concerned in a way that made my stomach drop. Inside, Kyle was sitting on my couch with both dogs at his feet. Officer Mendez stood near the door and said she needed to ask Kyle some questions about the dog's training. Kyle said they were emotional support animals, and he had documentation. She asked if they'd received any specialized training beyond basic obedience. Kyle hesitated and said he'd done some protection training with them for his personal safety. Officer Mendez asked him to demonstrate how the dogs responded to commands. Kyle looked uncomfortable but stood up and told the dogs to heel. They immediately moved to his sides. He told them to sit, and they sat. Then Officer Mendez asked him to show her their response to a threat scenario. Kyle said he'd rather not because they might get aggressive. She said that was exactly what she needed to see. Kyle refused and said he didn't have to prove anything about his own dogs. Officer Mendez turned to me and asked me to walk toward Kyle. I looked at her confused, and she nodded encouragement. I took 3 steps toward where Kyle was standing, and both dogs immediately moved to position themselves between us, their body language shifting to alert and defensive. I stopped moving, and the dogs stayed in place, blocking my path. Officer Mendez asked me to try to walk toward the bedroom hallway. I moved in that direction, and the dogs quickly repositioned to block me again, following my movement and maintaining a barrier between me and the rest of my house. Officer Mendez pulled out her phone and started recording. She asked Kyle directly if he'd trained these dogs to prevent me from accessing certain areas of my own home. Kyle said he hadn't trained them to do anything except protect him during anxiety attacks. She asked him why they were blocking me from moving freely in my own house, and he said they were probably picking up on my hostile energy toward him. Officer Mendez watched the dogs for another few minutes, having me try to move toward different areas while she recorded their behavior. Every time I tried to access my bedroom, my office, or even the kitchen, the dogs would reposition to block me. She asked Kyle to leave the room and go outside. He refused at first, but she said it wasn't optional if he wanted to avoid more serious intervention. Kyle went out the front door, and the dogs immediately became agitated, pacing and watching the door. Officer Mendez asked me to walk around my house freely. The dogs followed me to every room, positioning themselves between me and the exit, between me and my belongings, always maintaining what looked like a patrol pattern. She stopped recording and made a phone call. I heard her say something about tactical territorial training and possible domestic intimidation. She hung up and told me another officer with specialized training in working animals was coming to do a full assessment. We needed to keep the dogs contained until then. Officer Mendez went outside and told Kyle he needed to crate the dogs, or they'd be temporarily seized for evaluation. Kyle argued, but she said it wasn't negotiable. He came back inside and got both dogs into crates he apparently kept in his truck. Officer Mendez asked him to wait outside while she talked to me privately. Once Kyle was gone, she asked me directly if I felt safe in my home. I said not anymore. She asked if my wife knew about the dog's behavior, and I said I'd been trying to tell her for months, but she thought I was overreacting. Officer Mendez asked if I had somewhere else I could stay for the next few days while they investigated. I said I could go to my brother's place across town. She said that would be best, and she'd contact me after the specialized officer assessed the dogs. She asked me to document everything I could remember about Kyle's visits and the dog's behavior and send it to her email. I spent the next hour writing down every incident, every time the dogs blocked me, every visit when Kyle was in my bedroom or office with the dogs, every time I felt like I couldn't move freely in my own space. The specialized officer arrived as I was finishing my documentation. His name was Officer Raymond Park, and he introduced himself as having 15 years of experience with working dogs and tactical training. He asked Kyle to bring the dogs out of their crates one at a time. Kyle looked pale and nervous, but complied. Officer Park watched each dog separately, giving commands and observing their responses. He had Kyle demonstrate the dog's training, and then he asked Kyle to step away while he worked with the dogs himself. What happened next made my skin crawl. Officer Park had me stand in different locations around my house while he observed how the dogs reacted. They would position themselves to block my access to rooms, to create barriers between me and exits, to essentially control my movement through my own space. He recorded everything on his phone and took detailed notes. After 45 minutes, he told Kyle to crate the dogs again and called Officer Mendez over for a private conversation. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I saw Officer Mendez's expression shift from concerned to angry. She came back inside and asked me to step outside with Officer Park while she talked to Kyle alone. Outside, Officer Park explained that the dogs had been trained in territorial dominance behaviors, specifically targeting one person while remaining neutral to others. This wasn't standard protection training or emotional support work. The dogs had been conditioned to see me as an intruder in my own home and to establish control over my movement and access to space. He said this kind of training took months of deliberate work and wasn't something that happened accidentally. Someone had systematically taught these dogs to treat me as a threat that needed to be contained. He asked if I knew anyone with military or law enforcement training who might have helped Kyle. I said Kyle worked in IT and as far as I knew had no background in dog training beyond some YouTube videos he'd mentioned about protection dogs. Officer Park said YouTube was probably exactly where he'd learned this. There were channels that taught tactical dog training for personal protection, and some of them crossed into intimidation techniques that were illegal in residential settings. He said based on what he'd observed, the dogs were being used as instruments of psychological warfare to make me uncomfortable in my own home. This wasn't about Kyle's anxiety or emotional support needs. This was about establishing dominance and control over shared space by making me the outsider. He asked if there were any other concerning behaviors I'd noticed. I told him about Kyle searching my belongings, showing up when Rachel wasn't home, spending hours in my bedroom and office with the dogs. Officer Park said that fit the pattern perfectly. The dogs were being used to claim territory by marking it with their presence, and by conditioning them to block my access. He said he'd seen this before in domestic disputes, where one party used trained animals to intimidate or control another person without leaving physical evidence of abuse. Officer Mendez came back outside with Kyle following her. She told him he was being issued a citation for improper animal control, and the dogs would be temporarily seized pending investigation into their training and behavior. Kyle started yelling that she couldn't take his emotional support animals, and he'd sue the city. She said the dogs had been trained to restrict someone's movement in their own home, which qualified as using animals for intimidation and harassment. That was illegal, regardless of their emotional support status. Kyle pulled out his phone and called Rachel. I heard him tell her the police were trying to take his dogs because I'd made false complaints. Rachel must have said she'd come home because Kyle said he'd wait for her. Officer Park loaded both dogs into his animal control vehicle, while Kyle stood on my driveway looking furious and helpless. I felt relief flood through my body watching those dogs leave my property. Officer Mendez said she'd follow up with me in 24 hours, and I should stay somewhere else tonight in case the situation escalated. I packed a bag and drove to my brother Marcus's apartment. He took one look at my face and made up the couch without asking questions. I told him everything while we ate takeout Chinese food, and he kept shaking his head in disbelief. He said he'd noticed I looked sick at family gatherings but thought it was work stress. He asked what Rachel was saying about all this, and I pulled out my phone to check. 15 missed calls and 20 text messages, all from Rachel. The messages started with confusion, asking what happened with animal control and why Kyle's dogs were seized. Then they shifted to anger, saying I'd gone too far and involved authorities in a family matter. The most recent message said we needed to talk immediately, and she couldn't believe I'd done this to her brother. I showed Marcus, and he said maybe I shouldn't respond until I'd talked to a lawyer. I said I didn't think I needed a lawyer for an animal control issue. Marcus said I might need one for a divorce. Rachel showed up at Marcus's apartment at 10 p.m. She pounded on the door until Marcus answered and demanded to see me. I came out of the living room and she immediately started yelling about how I'd gotten her brother's emotional support animals taken away, and didn't I understand how traumatic that was for him. I said the dogs were trained to trap me in my own home and prevent me from moving freely. She said that was ridiculous, and I was making things up to justify my vendetta against Kyle. I pulled up Officer Park's report on my phone and tried to show her, but she wouldn't look at it. She said the officers were probably just backing my story because I'd called them first and manipulated the situation. I asked if she seriously thought I'd convinced 2 animal control officers to make up an entire report about tactical training. She said I'd obviously exaggerated my allergies and made Kyle look dangerous when he was just trying to manage his mental health. Marcus stepped between us and said Rachel needed to leave and we could talk when everyone was calmer. Rachel told him to stay out of it, and he said I was his brother and staying at his place, so it was his business. She looked at me and said, if I didn't come home right now and fix this situation with Kyle's dogs, she was done. I said, if she couldn't see that her brother had been systematically harassing me for 8 months, then maybe we were already done. She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in her expression, like she was realizing I actually meant it. She said she'd given me everything, a home and a marriage and a family, and this was how I repaid her, by destroying her relationship with her brother. I said she'd given her brother access to my home without my permission, ignored my serious medical condition, and chosen his comfort over my safety every single time. If that was her definition of a good marriage, then we wanted different things. She left without saying anything else, and Marcus locked the door behind her. We stood in his hallway, and he said I could stay as long as I needed. Officer Mendez called the next morning with an update. The dogs had been evaluated by a veterinary behaviorist, who confirmed they'd been trained with territorial dominance commands, specifically targeting one individual. The training was consistent with protection techniques, but applied in a way that violated local ordinances about animal control and harassment. Kyle was being charged with misuse of animals for intimidation, and if convicted, could face fines and permanent loss of the dogs. She asked if I wanted to pursue a restraining order against Kyle, and I said yes. She walked me through the process, and I spent the afternoon filing paperwork at the courthouse. The temporary restraining order was granted that evening, preventing Kyle from coming within 500 feet of me or my home. Officer Mendez said she'd serve the papers to him tomorrow, and I should document any violations. I asked what would happen to the dogs, and she said they'd likely be rehomed after a deprogramming period, where trainers would work to undo the territorial behaviors. I felt sad for the dogs who'd just been tools in whatever game Kyle was playing. Rachel texted that night saying I'd ruined her brother's life over some allergies and dogs being dogs. She said the restraining order was vindictive and proved I'd never cared about her family. I responded with a single message saying her brother had trained animals to trap me in my own home, and she'd enabled it by giving him unrestricted access and dismissing my medical condition for 8 months. She didn't respond. I called a divorce attorney the next morning and scheduled a consultation for later that week. Marcus said I could stay with him through the whole process if needed. My boss called asking if everything was okay because I'd been out for 2 days, and I explained the situation briefly. He said, "Take all the time I needed, and my job would be there when I was ready." I spent the next few days sleeping more than I had in months, my breathing easier without constant allergen exposure. My stress levels dropping as I realized I didn't have to manage Kyle's presence anymore. The divorce attorney said I had grounds for separation based on Rachel's enabling of harassment and her refusal to address my medical needs. She said the animal control reports and restraining order would support my case, that the living situation had become untenable through no fault of my own. We filed the paperwork that Friday. Rachel was served on Monday and called me 30 times in 1 hour. I didn't answer. She left voicemails ranging from angry to devastated, saying she couldn't believe I was throwing away our marriage over her brother, that she'd thought I loved her enough to work through family issues, that I was abandoning her when she needed me most. I listened to all of them and felt nothing but exhaustion. I tried to work through the family issues for 8 months while she dismissed every concern I raised. Her definition of working through it meant me suffering in silence while Kyle did whatever he wanted. The restraining order hearing happened 2 weeks later. Kyle showed up with a lawyer who argued that the animal control report was biased and the dogs were simply well-trained protection animals responding to my hostile behavior toward their owner. Officer Park testified about the specific training behaviors he'd observed and provided video evidence of the dogs blocking my movement throughout my own home. The veterinary behaviorist testified that the behaviors were not standard protection responses, but rather targeted territorial control designed to make one specific person feel unwelcome and unsafe. Kyle's lawyer tried to argue that I'd invited the conflict by calling animal control instead of resolving things through family communication. I testified that I'd tried family communication for 8 months and it had resulted in declining health and my wife giving her brother unrestricted access to my home. The judge granted a permanent restraining order and said the evidence clearly showed a pattern of using animals to intimidate and control. Kyle would be charged with animal harassment under city ordinance and the dogs would not be returned to him. Rachel filed a counterpetition for divorce 2 days later claiming I'd abandoned the marriage and caused emotional distress to her family. Her lawyer tried to argue that I'd been controlling and unsupportive of her brother's mental health needs. My lawyer submitted all my medical documentation, the animal control reports, the Ring camera footage of Kyle searching my belongings, the timeline of incidents I'd documented. The mediator assigned to our case said it was clear there had been serious issues with boundaries and medical needs being ignored and recommended separation with equitable division of assets. Rachel fought the recommendation and demanded I pay for her brother's legal fees and the cost of rehoming his dogs. The mediator said no and recommended I actually receive compensation for my medical expenses incurred due to allergen exposure I'd tried to prevent. We settled out of court 3 months later. Rachel got the house since her name was on the mortgage first. I got my retirement accounts and my car and $15,000 for medical expenses. We split everything else down the middle. Kyle was convicted of misuse of animals for intimidation and fined $5,000 plus court costs. He was banned from owning dogs for 5 years and required to complete an anger management program. The dogs were adopted by a family in another state after months of retraining. I heard through mutual friends that Rachel blamed me for destroying her family and refused to speak my name. Her parents apparently took Kyle's side and said I'd overreacted to normal family closeness. I didn't care anymore. I'd spent 8 months drowning in my own home while everyone told me I was being dramatic. Officer Mendez sent me a follow-up email 6 months after everything ended, saying she'd seen too many cases like mine where family members used animals as weapons in domestic power struggles. She was glad I'd called and gotten out before it escalated further. She said the dog's training showed clear progression toward eventual aggression, and I'd probably avoided serious injury by acting when I did. I moved into a small apartment with Marcus's help and started rebuilding my life. My breathing improved within weeks without constant allergen exposure. My allergist said the asthma was reversing and I might not need the inhaler much longer. I went to therapy and worked through the guilt I felt about the divorce and the anger at Rachel for choosing her brother over my health. My therapist said family enmeshment was real and some people couldn't see abuse when it came from someone they loved. Rachel had been conditioned to prioritize Kyle's needs and my needs had never stood a chance against that dynamic. I dated eventually and was honest about my failed marriage and the bizarre circumstances that ended it. Most people were horrified and supportive when I told them the full story. I met someone eventually who thought the idea of training dogs to intimidate your brother-in-law was psychotic and said she'd have called the police after the first incident. We took things slow and built something healthy without family interference. 2 years after the divorce, I got a message from Rachel's cousin who I'd always liked. She said Rachel and Kyle had a falling out and weren't speaking anymore. Apparently Kyle had started dating someone seriously, and Rachel felt left out of his life after she'd sacrificed her marriage to support him. The cousin said Rachel had mentioned regretting not believing me about the dogs and wondering if things could have been different if she'd set boundaries with her brother. She asked if I'd be willing to talk to Rachel, who was apparently in therapy working through family enmeshment issues. I thought about it for a long time and eventually responded that I appreciated Rachel's growth, but had moved on and didn't think reconnecting would be healthy for either of us. Some damage couldn't be undone, and some relationships couldn't be salvaged. I hoped Rachel found peace with her choices and learned to prioritize her own well-being over enabling family members. The cousin said she understood and wished me well. 3 years after everything ended, I was living in a house I'd bought myself with a partner who respected my boundaries and a job I loved and lungs that worked properly again. I ran into Officer Mendez at a coffee shop and she remembered me immediately. We talked for a few minutes, and she said my case had actually changed some of their training protocols for recognizing animal-assisted harassment. They now specifically looked for territorial behavior patterns when responding to domestic calls involving pets. She said I'd helped other people by speaking up and going through the legal process. I thanked her for taking me seriously when everyone else thought I was crazy. She said that was her job, and she wished more people called before situations became dangerous. I left that coffee shop feeling like maybe all the pain and divorce and conflict had meant something beyond just my personal survival. Maybe someone else wouldn't have to spend 8 months unable to breathe in their own home because people now knew what to look for. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.